Given the moment we're in, we thought with today's seminar that we would ask experts to share some of the science that ties together some of the most salient social issues of the day and the importance of the health of the Salish Sea. With that, we'll start with Matt Sparke. Matt is a professor of politics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He works at the intersection of geography, politics, and global health, and examines the changing geography of citizenship and its exclusions in the context of globalization. It's led his research on the politics of global health to come to a theory that he calls biological subcitizenship. Matt, please share what you mean by biological subcitizenship.
All right, let me start by trying to screen share. Greetings, everyone. So here we go. So it's a real honor to join you all today and to pick up on that last point. What I mean by biological subcitizenship is basically the inequalities of being human today, and they're very clearly illustrated unfortunately, by our experience of COVID here in the US. And so I wanted to just go through some recent data that have come out that highlight these inequalities. There's so much, obviously, controversy and political debate over this, but I just want to give you some key data points for joining those discussions, basically. You hear so many people talking about this crisis as a crisis in which we are all in this together as human beings. But the point I want to basically make here is that our unequal conditions of being human are leading to vast variations in vulnerability, damage, and death. The CDC just very recently, just last week, reported these age-adjusted COVID-19 hospitalization rates by race and ethnicity in the United States. And you can see the much elevated rates per 100,000 of population shared by Native Americans, by non-Hispanic African Americans, by Latinx populations, in comparison to Asian and Pacific Islanders and white populations. If you look at actual death rates, the CDC is reporting these dramatically unequal death rates due to COVID. And this is really quite striking for a wealthy country like the United States. African Americans have a rate of that's about 5 times higher than that of white people. Latinx populations are suffering a death rate that's 4 times higher than that of white people. And Native Americans also have, like African Americans, a death rate that's 5 times higher than that of white people. And as bad as those statistics are, they become even more shocking when you look at people in their middle ages. The American population gets, basically, it's whiter as it gets older. So we know that COVID affects the elderly more extremely and lethally. But if you look at the death rates of people in their middle years, for African Americans, it's 10 times higher than for white Americans. And for Latinx populations, it's about 8 times higher in that age group, 35 to 44. Given that you'll share an interest in the Salish Sea and it's named after the Coast Salish people, it's worth noting that COVID has had an extreme impact on Indian country across the United States. The Center for American Progress has drawn parallels with the original sort of weaponization of smallpox and other diseases in settler colonization on the continent. But the statistics are quite dramatic. The native people are only 10% of New Mexico's population, but more than 55% of its COVID cases. Native people are 3% of Wyoming's population, but more than 33% of its COVID cases. And the Navajo Nation has the highest per capita infection rate in the whole of the United States. So it's greater than that of the worst hit state of New York. So what what's causing this triple threat to Indian country? The pre-existing conditions that Native Americans live with, above average rates of diabetes, asthma, heart disease, cancer, respiratory disease, hypertension, and PTSD, all predispose them to vulnerability to COVID. But also 13% of Native Americans lack safe water and sewage disposal. So when they're told to wash their hands regularly, it becomes a challenge. Economic vulnerability has been a big issue in Indian country. Casino closures have hit tribal incomes, and that's hitting funding for health services. And they have a political vulnerability in our current political situation. There's bureaucratic holdups with the funding that was promised through the CARES Act. Their authority, the tribal authority, is often flouted. There's a case of the shelter-in-place order of the Yurok tribe in California, flouted by non-native neighbors. And they're frequently being treated as sub-citizens. In the most dramatic and unfortunate case, Seattle Indian Health Board was sent body bags when it was asking for medical supplies to fight COVID. There are other illustrations of inequality we can point to, of course, for Latinx and African American communities across the country. Many are living in or working in these so-called Petri dish spaces, crowded farm worker housing, homeless camps, many people working in care homes, which are a predominant site of COVID spread, and then of course prisons as well. Now, it's one thing to highlight all of these inequalities in vulnerability, damage, and death, but it's necessary to try to explain some of these inequalities too. We can't just list them. The danger is if you just list them, people will biologize them and say, that's those people, that's their problem. But there are these intersectional explanations that many social scientists and epidemiologists agree on as key causes that come together to intersect to explain these inequalities. Heightened exposure, the heightened pre-existing conditions I've mentioned, diminished access to medical care, and racialized damage done to resilience. Let me highlight that last one in particular here. What does that mean, racialized damage done to resilience? Resilience is a name for bouncing back after trauma. But if you're repeatedly subject to more trauma through police brutality and through blame the victim cultural narratives, bouncing back from trauma is that much more difficult. So African American populations and Latinx populations are frequently subject to these forms of racialized damage, and it does impact in turn their ability to bounce back from various kinds of health challenges, including COVID. And we're seeing now also economic damage to Black and Latinx populations that's going to have a knock-on effect into the future. My colleague here at UCSC, Rob Fairley, in economics, has highlighted that while there's been a huge economic catastrophe across the country of 22% decline in business ownership since the crisis began. But for African American self-employed business owners, the fall off is 41%, and for Latinx business owners, it's 32%. So there's an extra compounding effect of their businesses being the most vulnerable, and therefore then they're without income and economic opportunity to climb back out of the crisis afterwards. Lastly, I want to turn to something that's slightly less depressing, and to highlight that there are alternatives. And if you look across the Salish Sea, which I'm sure many of you love to do, to Canada, the Canadian case offers the example that this COVID crisis can be managed more effectively. And I've got here the COVID cases amongst Canadian First Nations reported by the Indigenous Services of Canada in June. And it basically shows, although the country's sort of an uneven pattern of infection, but the total positive cases are so low, and they've been able to flatten the curve fairly quickly. Alberta is a little bit, but more risky, but basically in BC, we've seen a spike in positive cases in mid-April, but then a falling off since then. So the BC's case is quite different to even Washington State to the south, and obviously Washington State's done a better job of managing the crisis than other states. I don't have much more. I don't have any more time, so I'll stop here. But if you're interested in following some more of the things I've been working on relating to COVID, I want to refer you to this article I've just published in the Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers that seeks to contextualize the crisis, not just within North America, but globally. So thanks very much. I'm looking forward to learning from the other speakers.
Thank you, Matt. Our next speaker is Dr. Tracey Goldstein. Tracey is a wildlife virologist and associate director of the One Health Institute, where she oversees the One Health Institute's laboratory and its marine ecosystem health diagnostic and surveillance laboratory. And Tracey is among a handful of scientists who have studied and published on coronaviruses on a global scale. So an excellent participant in our panel today to tell us about the pandemic and how we got here.
Being here, I couldn't resist putting some of these striking images from around the world about the current situation that we all find ourselves in. And let's see, And I wanted to take a step back, and we've been talking so much about the virus, and I think it's this unprecedented global change that has led us to where we are today, and possibly going to continue to lead us to where we will be, again in the future. And I really like this image that just recently came out last year, and it sort of talks about how these big changes in the environment, from land use to climate change, is all really changing the dynamics of how we live and the animals that we come in contact with, and what's happening in our environment that is leading us or making us vulnerable to exposure to new disease. And I think this image not likely or very nicely illustrates it, that it's occurring at all levels, at sea, land, and the air. And so for the last 10 years, we've been trying to understand, where is it that coronaviruses live, sort of the species they live in, the parts of the world that they live in, trying to really understand, where is the risk? And again, taking a very, very slight step back, remembering that SARS-CoV2, or the disease or the virus that causes COVID-19, is the third severe coronavirus that we now know that affects humans. So SARS-1, that emerged in 2002, was the first time that we realized that this group of viruses could cause severe disease, and then of course MERS after that. But these human coronaviruses actually have been circulating in people for many, many years and cause mild disease, often like respiratory illness. And so trying to understand how it is that these more severe forms emerge and where they live is really important to try to understand the future. So through our work for the last 10 years, we were able to work in some of these more remote locations in the world, in the tropics, in Africa and Asia, to try to understand where exactly these viruses might be found. And what's striking when you look at the more than almost 20,000 individuals that we sampled, including bats, rodents, people, and primates, by far the majority of positives were found in bats. And in fact, more than 90% of the viruses that we found were found in bats. And when you start looking at where these viruses are found, what you find is that where there are more bats, you find more viruses. And where there's more types of bats, you find more types of viruses. So there's something about the life history of these animals and where they live in their diversity that's really driving exposure to these viruses. And not only all viruses, but there's an association with certain bat families and certain types of viruses. So you're seeing some examples here, and of course, because of the outbreak, I'm going to talk about SARS coronaviruses. So 2B or SARS-related coronaviruses are the group that's highlighted there. And what we see there is that there's two families of bats, rhinolophid and hippocytorant bats, that are associated with these types of viruses. And our group has been studying this for a little while and knew this for a little while. And in fact, SARS-1 came from a rhinolophid bat. And so as soon as this outbreak occurred, we wanted to think about what is it that we can learn from our data and how might that inform this outbreak. And why is it important to know which bat hosts have which viruses? Well, one of the things you can do is try to look at where do these animals live and where else might you find these viruses. So what we did here is it's sort of a version of a heat map where we looked at the species of bats in which we found the viruses. So the SARS-related viruses that we found in our project are the little black dots around the world. And we overlaid that with where did we find or where do we think the bat species that carry those viruses live, so we could try to see where are there hotspots in the world of where you might find them. And of course, you see there in Southeast Asia and in China, a big red hotspot. So obviously we know that that's where SARS-1 and now SARS-2 emerged. But look at the other parts of the world. Look at Africa. There are these hotspot areas in West Africa, along sub-Saharan belt and in sort of Central East Africa. And in fact, we did find SARS-related viruses there. So one of the lessons here is let's not be surprised anymore. Let's not think about where things have been found in the past, but let's understand more about where these viruses may be living, what species might be carrying them, and where we're coming and how we're coming in contact with them, so that can inform on risk for the future and so that we can prepare and make plans for the future. So what do we know about SARS-CoV2 and bats? Well, as I said, work that's been done before has shown that rhinolophid bats, which is some of these on the top left, have been associated with SARS-1. And data that we have found since that time suggests that SARS-2 also is likely coming from the same group of bats. But as you can see here, bats are very, very diverse. They play very, very different roles in the ecosystem. And so understanding which bats might carry which viruses is really important to understand where the risk might be and how we might try to mitigate that, how we might try to protect people in the future if we understand how contact is occurring. So what about marine mammals? I've been asked a lot about what is the risk to coronaviruses in marine mammals and what do we know about coronaviruses in marine mammals? And you know, not a lot. We do know some. We've learned that there are some alpha coronaviruses in harbor seals and in California sea lions, sometimes associated with disease, sometimes not. Alpha coronaviruses are the same ones in people that cause upper respiratory infections. We've also found gamma coronaviruses in Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphins and also in beluga whales. And gamma coronaviruses are usually associated with birds. So maybe there's something about exposure to cetaceans and birds at sea that might link the types of viruses that they might be exposed to. But that's really all we know. And we've never found a SARS-related coronavirus before in marine mammals. So of course, there's lots of concern about risk. I know people are very concerned about the killer whales up in the Salish Sea. I think the important thing to remember is that this is a human outbreak. The virus heavily lives in us. So we're the ones where the risk is coming from. And so because of that, places where we might think there could be risk is places such as captive facilities or rehabilitation centers where we're coming in contact with these animals. So I think it's important for us to remember to wear PPE, distance ourselves where we can, and definitely not go into work when we're ill because we are ones potentially placing these animals at risk. There's been some work, I think many of you by now are familiar with the ACE2 receptor. That's the way the SARS coronavirus gets into human cells, and wondering about can it get into marine mammal cells. And indeed, all marine mammals, or in fact all mammals, have ACE2 receptors, but they're all a little bit different. And there is some work showing that the receptors in these marine mammals are just slightly different enough that they may not be as susceptible to humans. And in fact, so far to date, we have not seen any infected marine mammals, and we've been doing some testing in our lab. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be vigilant, and that doesn't mean we should protect them from contact with us. And then the other thing that people have asked about is sort of virus survival in seawater and sewage outflows. And while we don't know for sure for this virus, there's been some work showing other coronaviruses don't survive very well in sewage outflows. Likely they won't survive well in seawater, and they do better at body temperature versus the colder temperatures out in the ocean. So hopefully that means that risk for marine mammals is not very high as long as we take precautions to protect exposure from us. And I wanted to end where I started. And I think what Matt's been talking about is sort of no more obvious than in the Arctic. You can't think about marine mammals and not think about the Arctic. And you can't think about vulnerable people until you sort of think about the remoteness of Alaska and how climate change and social inequalities are making them hugely vulnerable to many, many different things, including disease. So I think this just sort of image illustrates the number of differences that we're seeing out in the Arctic. We've seen unprecedented sea ice temperatures, sea temperatures this year. In fact, I think 2 weeks ago I was on a call and the sea temperature was 45 degrees Fahrenheit right now in late May, which is unprecedented. For the last 2 years, there's been almost no sea ice forming between Alaska and Russia and the Bering Sea. And so, of course, this is having huge effects on habitat loss for people and also for animals. So when these animals are having to swim further for food, swim further to find places to haul out, that affects the health. That also in turn affects the native people that rely on them for their livelihood. And I think nowhere then in the environment are places like this just so obvious how what we're changing is going to need really creative teams, such as the group that works here at SeaDoc Society, to bring the right people together to try to solve these big global problems. And with that, I'm going to hand that over to Jonna.
Thank you, Tracey. Our next panelist, Dr. Jonna Mazet, is epidemiologist and disease ecologist at UC Davis, where she's also executive director of the One Health Institute, where her work focuses on global health problem solving for emerging infectious disease and conservation challenges. She is, for her work, she's been recognized. She's appointed to the National Academies and also a founder of the SeaDoc Society. So thank you for that also, Jonna.
Thank you. Also a wildlifer, yeah. So proud of that too. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to try and watch Joe because I know we are just about out of time and no questions have been asked yet. So you wave me off anytime, Joe, and but I'll try to zip through. And I think Dr. Goldstein did a great job of introducing some of the things I wanted to say. We are in the midst of this 6th mass extinction event of plants and animals. And as we think about those, in fact, my screen doesn't want to change. As we think about those extinctions and what's happening on our planet, and we think about the overwhelming issues that are affecting the human population, including COVID and our awakenings towards Black Lives Matter, I think we can't overburden ourselves with these overwhelming pieces without feeling down. And that's a big part of what's going on right now. But when we think about, I know all of you care about these species, and we are faced right now with questions because of what's happening with the planet about whether or not we are going to have to stop trying to save some species and whether they are to be allowed to die out. And I don't know if the animals are able to adapt fast enough to deal with these things like the shrinking sea ice. And honestly, I don't know if we are as humans either. And I'm not trying to be overly dramatic. I'm just acknowledging what you all are feeling, and that is that we are in an unprecedented awakening of what's happening to our planet and our societies. And this is a map actually showing that climate refugees from drought and storms and ocean rising is happening and affecting the human populations and the animal populations all over the planet, and disproportionately affecting indigenous peoples that have no representation in their governments, and push them into refugee situations where they often have extreme health issues, no representation, again, very little health care, and intense exposures, just like how we put animals into extreme circumstances in order to feed the human planet. And these issues around nutrition are also issues that disproportionately affect and alter the health systems of Black Americans, of Latinx populations, of Native peoples all over the world. And so we're going to have to think about how we feed the planet. We're seeing a lot of pressure and questions about how people in what we might consider remote areas eat strange foods and do strange practices that sometimes devastatingly affect our wildlife populations. And those are crucial to address, but we have to be careful that we're not only blaming, again, certain parts of our populations that are already have very little access to protein and health systems. So, we don't really have a ton of time. I think we want to talk about the questions, but I want to make sure that you understand that what we're thinking about and going through here is not just happening here at home. This is a picture of a location where we were working to look for coronaviruses in Senegal, where obviously people and animals are mixing and food is mixing. Similarly, in places like this where we work in Nepal, it is the people that are forced to live in urban settlements, temporary settlements that aren't very temporary, where again, they are pushed into healthcare situations and exposure situations that are quite different than I ever have to imagine and deal with. And we need to think about the planet and the people on those planets. The ongoing obstacles that we're all facing are disproportionately, again, difficult for people in very tragic circumstances, like people who are sheltering with abusive family members, have very little access to food, children that only have access to food when they go to school and they're not going to school. And hopefully someone helped those Title I schools get their food program going and delivering to home, but not all of them did. So we're talking about overwhelming obstacles that increase the mental health, stress, and devastation that put people on edge and maybe are contributing to their acting out in ways that they might not otherwise act out. Hopefully they're also contributing to ways that people act out and protest when they might not otherwise act it out peacefully with their communities and police officers. But sometimes it is sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. So just to end, I'd like to give you a blueprint for hope. I'd like to have those of you who are willing and interested share that there are things we can do. Take these to your institutions, take these things to your networks, take these things to your policymakers. We can get out of this and we can keep it from happening again, but we have to work hard together to do that. We need to listen, learn, reflect, and act. We need to remember and stress and reiterate that Black Lives Matter, and we need to respect humanity and this planet and use transdisciplinary approaches to solve these problems. Joe.
Thank you, Jonna, for bringing in the inequality with the ecosystem that we face all the time. And I want to remind all of us that even though we do live in a beautiful urban center of Seattle and Vancouver, that things are no different here. When we have beach closures because of high fecal coliform levels or other things like that, harmful algal blooms, there are 26 languages spoken in Seattle School District, and we put up a sign in English. That's a disadvantage to all those other families, the 25 different languages, who can't read that sign. And when I took the picture on the left here, you know, we have to remember that everything that the SeaDoc Society does, and it's really, you know, it's not the role of one small program to right all of the wrongs in the world, but if every program that were out there like the SeaDoc Society could be doing its part, then I think that we could recognize that we would all be doing a lot better right now. And so in the Sailor Sea, when the SeaDoc Society funds work that works on salmon recovery or works on improving water quality, we're not just doing that because we want to have more whales and people enjoy going whale watching. We're also working on it for people that are disadvantaged. So I remember being in a conversation with the EPA a few years ago when they said, look, the tribal communities in the Salish Sea are eating too much salmon. And I realized that the problem was not that they're eating too much salmon. The problem was that we were not bringing the contaminant levels low enough in salmon that those people could eat what they needed to eat and they had traditionally been able to eat. And so the work that we do from a science perspective benefits everybody, and especially those that are disadvantaged. A couple of years ago, Audrey Benedict and I put out a kids book that was the Salish Sea kids book here. And when we did that, we realized that, hey, we don't want to just have this book being made available to kids that can afford it. And so at that time we had a campaign, an Indiegogo campaign, to try and raise money for this book. And we raised probably $25,000 at that time. And the idea was that we could provide books to kids at tribal schools, First Nation schools, and at Title I schools, even though they couldn't afford it. And this is a quote from a woman in a Latinx community. We gave them 100 books for a summer program. And she said, I can't tell you how exciting this is. A great teaching book in the hands of the students who have very few books in their homes. Some of them have lived within 10 miles of the Salish Sea their entire lives, but have never been to the beach. And so what we're trying to do with our science and with our education and with our outreach is really benefit not just the advantaged people, but benefit everybody. And there is a great quote in a book called Democracies, Gardens of Democracies, where they said, when everybody is better off, everybody is better off. And I feel that's really the way that it is right now for the work that the SeaDoc Society does. A healthy ecosystem is better for the animals and better for the people. And so I want to thank all of you for participating today, especially our speakers. We're going to make this available so lots of people can watch that. And thank you very much for your support.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, panelists. I just want to add my thanks to you all for a very thought-provoking presentation. We went just a bit over, so thanks everyone for sticking with us. I keep looking for the silver linings in what is otherwise a very wretched state for us all at the moment. And I think one of the silver linings for me is just the fact that this pandemic has really made people confront and think about how the disparities for people in terms of access to healthcare and the disparities in for our wildlife in accessing safe, pristine places to live where they don't have to interact with, have daily contact with humans. This is making us all think about how we are, people and animals and the environment are inextricably linked. And I think that that's a silver lining in all of this. So thank you for having us all think about that. I just wanted to, we did have one early question, and if you don't mind, Joe, I'll just pose one question, which was a great one. And I think Tracey probably directed for you. Obviously, there are some very significant populations of bats in North America. What can you say about coronaviruses in our bats here in the US?
Yeah, great question. Nothing, which is pretty impressive, right? So there's been a lot of work in the US looking at bats, but really primarily focusing on white nose syndrome. It makes sense that that bacteria, or the disease that's caused by a bacteria, sort of marched its way across decimating bats. And so that's where a lot of the focus has been. And so in fact, really thanks to Kirsten, this last week we've been putting together a proposal working with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we're going to start a project where we're going to look at local bats and sample them and test them for obviously SARS-CoV2, but really for coronaviruses. These are bats in rehab, so we do want to rule out exposure from contact with people, but really it'll be hopefully some pilot data to start to understand what coronavirus is circulating in bats in the US, and hopefully we can then expand that, take that little bit of data and get more funding and expand that. And we've got a lot of interest working with wildlife biologists, and so we're hoping to do more of that. So stay tuned, maybe I'll have it on speed this time next year.
Thanks, Tracey. We've got a couple other questions coming in. May I encourage you, please, to follow up the seminar with those questions to Joe by email, and he can reach out to our panelists and share those answers, because there's some good ones there too. So thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us for our virtual wildlife seminar. Panelists, again, thank you for great presentations. You've given us a lot to think about. Have a healthful and peaceful evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us.